So now I am curious. I'd like to find out from our panelists, when did you realize the moment exactly that gender equality and climate action go hand in hand? I'd like to hear a bit about that moment when that sparked for you, if I can speak. So I'm going to challenge the panelists to capture these thoughts in 2 minutes, if I can start with Eide.
I think first I'm very happy to be here on this panel, and I am absolutely convinced that there is a very stark relationship between gender equality and climate action. And I frankly don't really know when I realized, but it's a long time ago, because we in the Nordic countries have had for many years the attitude that gender equality is a part of everything. And since climate change is important, it's also a part of that. And I'll just mention 3 points just for introduction. One, we know that women and men are differently, are affected in different ways by the climate crisis itself. The African farmer, we'll hear more about, tends to be a woman. So if African agricultural change, that affects women maybe even more than men. In flood situations, for instance in Bangladesh, we know that a disproportionate number of women are killed and men survive, because men tend to get faster to the shelters, where women tend to try to bring the children along and are affected, and both the kids and the women drowns. So you see very stark difference in statistics in how you're affected by climate. We also know that, at least in our countries, women and men contribute differently to emissions. In my country, more men drive cars than women. More women are generally more positive to public transport or other climate-friendly means of transport, and men eat more meat. Which means that they also contribute to more emissions in their food consumption. And there are millions of examples. I'm not going to bore you with all those, but it really matters. And it means that a gender-sensitive polity, a society that has taken gender perspectives well on board, will probably also be more effective and more mature in its conversation about the urgency of climate change, but also how to deal with it. Last point is, in order to solve the climate crisis, we need the major transformation of almost everything: agriculture, transport, industry, energy provision, construction, housing, everything. So society will change, because we can't continue as now. And if everything is going to change, we cannot say first we change everything and then we think about the effect on gender. We have to integrate that from day one in how we change. When a lot of conversation, which is very good, is on just transition. We need a just transition, justice between people in a country, justice between countries, and justice between generations, ours and future generations. But much of the concrete discussions has been just transition of male work, because it's typically been about what do we do with the coal miners or the oil workers, or the industry people. So it's been a rather male discussion, how do you look after them? Whereas we know that every aspect of society will transform, we have tended to continue to focus on the male side of it. So broadening the gender perspective will enrich the climate debate, as broadening the gender perspective also enriches the debate about the economy and society in general, all across the board. And we Nordics, I am also, as you mentioned, President of the Nordic Council of Ministers in my area. And we Nordics have 2 statistics which are interesting for the rest of the world. We have a very high level of women participation in the workforce, which means we have a high participation in the workforce in general, because men work as much as in continental Europe, women work more. But we have a very divided workforce, because what women and men do is very different, more different than in other countries. So again, if you bring all voices into discussion, you'll get a richer and more intelligent conversation than if you allow it to continue on a male path.
Thank you so much. We're definitely going to talk more about these distinctions. Please also allow me to acknowledge the Executive Director for UN Women, Dr. Sima Bahous. Thank you so much for joining us, Doctor. If I can ask you, Dr. Bahous, when was the moment that you realized that gender equality and climate action indeed go hand in hand?
Thank you very much for this panel, and thank you for the audience for attending. I think I realized that gender equality in general is part and parcel of everything we do very, very early on in my life. And therefore, it is so important that we continue to look at that. And as we progressed in looking at issues, then yes, gender equality for me became a major part of what climate action needs to look like. And I think coming from where I come in my region, it has always been about gender equality for me and seeing the opportunities that women and girls should and can get to be able to move forward in life. The other thing I want to say is that every time I went to a conference, whether it was on any topic from the days when I was younger until today, I would always ask the same question: where are the other women? I was there, but where are the women? And I think we did ask the same question in the opening of this COP this time as well, when we said that we saw that picture actually that went viral on the fact that there are not enough women representation yet in climate change issues and in climate change. I'm told when we counted that there is only 7 women out of the 110 world leaders. So I want to say that representation matters, and representation in climate action matters, in climate change matters, and that is why and when we should all realize that this is where we really need to continue to make sure that women and girls are within and give the opportunities for them and the spaces to be within the climate action. Actually, they were not really waiting for us to do so. Many young people already took the floors, took the airwaves, and took leadership in promoting climate action and in promoting all the values that we look for in climate action. But I also want to say, on the maybe a little bit positive side now, that 80% of the national adaptation plans that were submitted in 2022 referenced different parties' gender-sensitive approaches towards climate adaptation, and also I think many of them also put through the importance of women's leadership and women's representation and gender equality within those plans. So that is something very important. We need to realize that. I also realized it now here also today, how important it is, and how important it is to follow through with the slogan of this particular COP is implementation together. And this is something very key. It might sound like it is a cliche, but it's not. It's really key to work together on that. I think to ensure also leadership of women in this, and this is when also I realized when I was working long time ago in the villages in the Middle East, but also in the Far East, is that women and climate action and agriculture and all this need smart solutions, but they need financing as well. And we need to ensure that if we want women really to be part and parcel of society and half of it and to be productive and so on, we need to continue to make that link between gender equality, women's empowerment, and any action that we are taking, especially as was mentioned by His Excellency the Minister from Norway, that most women are farmers and most women in the developing world are women who live off their farms, off their land, etc., etc. Another problem we need to look at is how do we ensure land ownership for these women who just go every morning to farm their lands, but they don't own it, they can't own it, and how do we make that connection? This is also so important. And as you work in development, as you work on gender equality, you realize it very, very, very early on as you start working in the communities. So that's one other thing I wanted to say. I also wanted to say that I think what we need to do is also to work together, and I think we are, as the AU, as the Nordic Council of Ministers, as UN Women, as all other UN agencies and UN sister agencies, to continue to look at climate justice and climate justice action for gender equality. This is something very important, and it is something that you realize much early on also, that there is justice is related to the plight of women everywhere, and therefore when there is a problem, anywhere, it is also related to gender equality and to women's situation and status in the land. Just one final thought is to say that CSW last year, the Commission on the Status of Women, was a commission that connected climate change with gender equality and women's and girls' empowerment. And this was a realization to me during that particular session that we really need to work much more on making that link. Because not all countries understand it. Many countries understand but don't appreciate. Many countries are working on it, and many countries still don't know what to do about it. And therefore, we really, as UN Women, as the international community, as the donor community, as the AU, as the Arab League, as all these institutions that can make and can convene countries and can make sure that we understand what that means for development, etc. This is something that we really need to work on together. Finally, I would say in the latest snapshot review that we have done on gender equality and SDG 5, we looked at how long it will take us to achieve gender equality in the world, and this report tells us, and it is fresh off the press 2 weeks ago, it tells us that if we continue at the level of acceleration that we are at today, which is really not acceleration, it will take us 286 years to achieve gender equality. So we need to look at that carefully and to see how best we can accelerate the work that we are doing, including on climate action. Thank you.
So you're talking about our great-great-great-great-grandchildren. Thank you so much for that. And also thank you for asking the thought-provoking question, where are women and girls in climate action policies? Thank you so much for that, Dr. Bahous. Let's hear from the African Union Commission, Sacko. When did this realization that gender equality needs to be a key element of climate change action, when did that realization strike you?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, every one of you, and thank you for giving African Union the opportunity to be in this important panel. The question I'm bringing is that we are here, organizing together, convening this with the Nordic countries. So I think that we have a lot to learn from the experience of the Nordic countries in terms of gender equality. So Africa should build upon those achievements that the Nordic countries have done so that we can advance also our agenda, our strategy on the human equality that we have at the Commission. So it's no longer in news. We know that the impact of climate change affects more women and children than men. So mostly there's some core areas like in agricultural production, food and nutrition security, water and energy. We have water, energy, health, climate-related disasters, migration, and conflicts. Women suffer a lot in these areas, and that's where we have to really focus and make sure that women are part of our conversation in terms of climate agenda. So in African Union, let me share what we are doing really. We have the common African position to integrate gender equality into the climate action agenda. And this was endorsed this year in March 8. March 8 is our International Day of Women, and we endorsed this document, this framework, and we are working on this framework. What we need today is to implement the recommendation that came out from this core tool that we have at the African Union Commission. So what are the areas that we would like to partner with the Nordic countries? It's more on amplifying your experience to bring the voice of African women in this negotiation. We have the African group of negotiators, but we don't have parity in terms of the representation of women. That's where we have to reinforce, and that during COP 2028, we will have at least a parity of our women representation in the African group of negotiation. We think it is very important for us course, to engage women in that conversation with partners. The second one, as we know that the sector that is most affected by the impact of climate change, and in Africa, 70% of our population are rural, 52% of women produce the food, 70% of the food we eat. So what are really the program that we have for women in order to mitigate the impact of climate change and change the model of cultivation in the rural settlement. So we have the main, we want to mainstream the gender climate smart agriculture. We want to modernize because it's a new generation of farmers, and they will not cultivate the way the older ones are cultivating, and we need to regenerate, the farmers, because the farmers are becoming old like me. So we need the youth to engage, to embark on a very, very attractive type of agriculture and resilient. So we believe that if we mainstream gender climate smart into our action, climate smart agriculture in the rural settling, and give the women opportunity to practice this climate smart agriculture, we really solve the problem of hunger and malnutrition in our continent. And
Thank you so much for those opening thoughts. Let me just quickly go to Agola.
Just let me, because I will soon leave.
Okay, no problem.
The last one, it is disaggregated data. We need disaggregated data because women do a lot, but we don't have evidence base of what they do. So we need really, if we can have this type of technical support or even financial to develop our own programs for the disaggregated data, we believe that is very important, because we have to have data to see the evidence of climate change, the impact of climate change on women. I thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's hear from Ogola from Kenya.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good afternoon, Excellency Ministers present, Commissioner, Executive Director of the UN, and participant. The first thing that I do everywhere I go, whenever I walk to a room, is to look at the participants or the crowd. And most of the time when we are talking about gender, and I look across the room, I only see women. Majority are women. So I think for me, at a personal level, I feel challenged. It's as if we are talking to ourselves, and then at the end of the meeting, we feel good that we spoke to ourselves. So as we are talking about gender issues, I'd request that we have mobilized more men, and even back at home, this is very, very common. And then the second thing, again, which is also personal to me, is that we are in this century and we are still talking about equality. And I believe that our men know that we are talking about this issue. The problem that we have in Africa is the cultural and traditional aspects that no matter how hard you put policies in place, how much awareness you create, and how much mobilization you do, you still will not be able to break the barriers that are denying us that recognition. And I talk, for example, when it comes to access to resources, access to land, access to leadership, even having your voice in the community as a woman, even if you have a lot of knowledge, more than your brother, for example, your brother will still be considered the one that is the leader. So he gets to speak, or you speak through them, and sometimes information is lost in translation. And so when we talk about women in the grassroots and adaptation, again, not all women have the same level of vulnerabilities. If you walk into a community, for example, where there's drought, there are women who are married, whose husband can anchor them with some support, not so much. Then there are single-headed households, there are widows, there are single women. So when you're talking about adaptation and building resilience of women, you have to further disaggregate that information to know who you are targeting. And if we had resources, if we really had resources, for me, I would also have an opportunity to bring such women to COP or to platforms where they themselves can communicate what they are going through so that whatever action that is taken on the ground is responsive to their needs. I keep saying that I'm not a gender expert, but I'm an African woman. I've gone through these experiences and I know what needs to be done. And most importantly, if you do not educate the girls, especially the ones who are living in a most vulnerable condition, you're likely to have a recurrence, a repeat pattern of vulnerability transferred from one generation to the next. So one way of making sure that the girls are lifted, and equally the most vulnerable boys also, because even boys are vulnerable, are lifted, is to make sure that we have some form of education or support for education for those girls in the most vulnerable communities, and we have microfinancing schemes that will lift these women out of poverty, like a revolving fund. In some countries, microfinancing schemes have worked. In Kenya, for example, we have seen transition from lighting using fuel wood to or kerosene to solar lanterns, just because of the microfinancing scheme, what we call through pay-as-you-go model, which everybody in the community can pay using through their what we call mobile banking. So it's easy to transfer money. You can get like a solar gadget, and then you have a spread out repayment period. So with that, you're able to transfer to use cleaner forms of energy. So this is just an example. So I think this is an implementation COP, and now our conversation should be like, we should go towards how do we make sure that women are involved in the implementation aspects of climate action.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Those solutions are exactly the kind of discussions that we want to have. So thank you for raising that, and also for reminding us that men indeed need to be a part of this conversation. So finally, let's hear from the minister from Finland, Sarkkinen. When did you realize that these two elements should go hand in hand and not be progressing separately as they have been traditionally?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. Dear friends, I think feminism has given me like cognitive tools to see that you have to take gender into account in all policies, also in the climate policies. And also, it's not enough just to see the gender, you also need to see the intersecting identities of people, including gender, but also wealth, disability, ethnicity, and etc. Because not all women are in the same position when it comes to climate change or other challenges. Well, gender and climate are priorities for Finland, as they are for other Nordic countries also. And Nordic Council of Ministers have given this green and equal Nordic region commitment for feminist action for climate justice under the generation equality. And this is, we are committed to bringing these two issues together. But now we have to implement it in all of our policies, and that is a challenge for us. But I think also the African women and African leaders have taught me a lot about the intersecting natures of climate change and gender, and it teach me a lot when I read this African countries' common position on equality and climate action. So I really think that we can learn from each other, because I think also Africa is the region where the climate change hit hardest. So I think we really need to learn from each other. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these opening thoughts. And as you can see here, this event is doing something quite profound. We have brought together African, Nordic, and UN women leaders to discuss how gender truly is key and into the green transition, and also how to move forward. So the idea for this event is really to share ideas, experiences, and lessons learned. So I would like to first ask Mr. Eide, can you help to provide context a bit more for the audience? From your perspective, why is it so important really to integrate these two elements?
Well, I think it's important because it helps us to understand how climate change affects people. People, as we know, are women and men, girls and boys. And in order to, I think it's always useful to have a gender lens and to see if we can see differences, if we can see varied approaches that will draw our attention better to those who need it most. So I think that's one part of it. The fact that we know that women and men relate differently to climate policies and live somewhat different lives with different choices is also important when we design climate policy for all kinds of societies, be they developed countries with a high agricultural sectors or in advanced welfare states like the Nordic countries. And I think it also will affect policy making significantly if we make sure that women and girls, young women, are more involved, of course, together with men and boys. It's not only women, but it's a gender perspective. And my experience as having grown up in and lived in an increasingly equal rights-oriented Nordic country, nobody's perfect, we have a long way to go, but relative to many others, is that the society that creates is better for everyone, for men and women. And we understand things differently, and we get a broader perspective on key issues in life. And since the green transition is the transition of everything, the entire society, it's not like we will live more or less like yesterday, but a little bit greener. The green transition is a fundamental shift. It means we're going to use resources over and over again rather than extract and throw them away. It means that we will need to have a different kind of agricultural systems, that we have to design our cities differently, that we have to design transport systems in a different way. This affects everyone, and in the way it affects women and men differently matters to that kind of societal change. And I would also say that, on this theme of just transition, it has to be just for everyone, just between generations, and also just as in just towards those who come later. And I think there's a certain tendency that still, it shouldn't be so, but still I think it's true that women are more focused on the future of their kids. So, which means that they will be more interested in how the world will look like in the future, and less about maximizing profit right now, which is slightly more a male thing. Women are working on that too, by the way. We're not that different, but there is an element which I think we should not undermine. And again, a fossil extractive world is very associated with the masculine perspective on life. So there's also, there's an issue here about not only counting women. I mean, I totally agree that we need more women in negotiations. I think that, we have been working hard to get gender parity wherever we can, and we have legal obligation on company boards on the stock exchange, 40% of the least represented gender. But it's not only about counting women. It's also about making women count. So the numerical thing is not the whole thing. It's to have a genuine, real, equal participation of women and men creates better decisions, both in the private and the public sector.
So now, before we go into the meat of the conversation, I'd like to ask Dr. Bahous, what do you hope to see achieved between African and Nordic leaders by coming together in a forum like this one to discuss these relevant matters?
Thank you again. And, I'd like to see us all, African leaders, Arab leaders, Nordic leaders, all leaders, to look at women as the solution makers. Women are resilient. Of course, they are disproportionately affected by the climate crisis in terms of poverty, in terms of unemployment, in terms of unpaid care work, in terms of violence sometimes, in terms of being on the move and as IDPs in their countries, depending on where we are in that. But at the same time, they have shown us each and every time that although the impacts on women are most, and although they pay the highest prices for these kinds of this crisis and the climate crisis, but they are also the solution makers in their own homes, in their own communities, and in their own countries in so many ways. I think what we really need to do, all of us, is to see that we have this green transition is also looks at the leadership and agency of women and activate it as much as possible, give the spaces, as I said before. We have seen and we have heard that we need more education in STEM for women and girls, but my reading now of many of the statistics is that, for example, in the Middle East and maybe also in Africa, we do see more and more women coming into STEM. STEM is important for us to bring more and more women into that so that we can also help them exercise their agency in bringing the solutions that are needed for the green transition of the economies, but also of the whole climate crisis. I think we also need to look at all of us together globally how to increase funding for women's and gender equality issues and as they relate to climate action. I am surprised also to still see that the funding is so little, and we have a number of our funding partners here whom we really appreciate so much, and we really cherish that partnership, but I still see that it is extremely low, estimated at 0.01% of worldwide funding coming to gender equality and climate action. So we really need to look at how we can, all of us together, increase that, not only the donor countries, but also for different other countries who need the funding, to help the donors see where this funding will have best impact on women and girls in climate action. I also see that there are maybe three areas where we need to look quickly at how we can critically go forward. One is increase the proportion of women and girls in decision making and in leadership positions. That is very important at both the national and the global levels, and so that we can see them in environmental governance and in different sectors related to the transition to an equal, inclusive, circular and regenerative green economy. This is one. The other thing is, as was said earlier, to ensure access to education and training for women and girls. This is very important, including the development and launch of new best practices and best practice standards for green and gender transformative learning incorporated into national action plans and national determined contributions, also to ensure that women and girls are there, and to boost access for financing. We could have more money for climate action, but we need to make sure that women access that kind of finance, and that this helps them to help us all bring together gender just climate solutions. So again, we need to, in so many ways, invest in and leverage the resilience of women, also of men. I mean, as head of UN Women, I always say that gender equality is not only about women, it is about men and women. So we need to see that how best both of us, both men and women, can come together and discuss the issues of climate and gender, and also to build the resilience of all. The issue of data is very important on all these issues that we are talking about. And I must tell you also that we need to see more data on girls. I find that every time I look at data sets, the girls are absent. So if we want to make sure that women are participating, their needs are met, their resilience is leveraged, and their solutions are being understood and accepted, we also need to see how they were doing when they were girls as well, and how we can push them forward. Very little statistics on girls these days that we really need to ensure is there in the statistics where we can benefit from as well. And finally, I would say that yes, maybe we should always be asking two questions depending on where we are sitting in the meetings. Where are the women? But sometimes we need to ask, where are the men? And they are here.
I'm here.
Thank you so much for that. I like what you said about women being the solution makers. That's definitely a tweetable quote. So at this time, I would like to acknowledge our African and Nordic delegates. These are keynote listeners. They are in the audience. I would like to invite one of the youth delegates to give a reflection on what has been said so far. So just please come forward, introduce yourself, your delegation, and perhaps the nationality where you're coming from. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. My name is Joanita Babire. I'm from Uganda. I work with Girls for Climate Action. I'm here with the NALA Femme delegation and also part of the Generation Equality Feminist Action for Climate Justice. This has been a very insightful conversation. And for me, it's again on we are doing this or we want to do this. But I think personally when I was coming for COP, when we were at Glasgow, they said this is going to be an implementation COP. And I've been wondering to myself, who is supposed to answer the how if we are still questioning ourselves on how can we even provide climate finances to, how can we make climate finances accessible to women at the grassroots level? How can we do this and this? How can we include women in policy? So for me, the question is on who is supposed to answer the how? How can we have finances accessible? And also like that we are also having the conversation of engaging men and women all together. I work with communities at the grassroots, and actually someone will not come for a training, one, because the men cannot allow them to come. So as we are also talking about bringing them into these spaces, we need to be able to engage men as well in the conversation, because what is happening is society is not already ready for them to take positions, and we are also pushing them to take positions. But in the process, we need to actually engage them quite a lot, I would say that. And also, as we are also talking about policies, implementation is lacking a lot. I think even Uganda has super cool policies where they're actually, I did an analysis of the policies in Uganda, and they're also talking about how women are vulnerable. This is the conversation even here. But at what level do we say, let's engage them in the implementation? Because policies are super nice. Implementation is lacking. So for me, who, how are the questions that I would raise today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Juanita. So who is supposed to answer the how? That's a very thought-provoking question. Would any of our panelists like to tackle this? Who answers the how, the mechanisms of how to actually tackle the issues that we're dealing with? Yes, a minister from Finland.
Thank you. Of course, in the end, it is the governments who are responsible for climate action and implementing the common decisions. But of course, even the UN organizations, they bear a lot of responsibility for implementation. But I think when it comes to funding, of course, it is quite obvious that we need to do more when it comes to climate funding. But also, I have been wondering, how can the funding that is in place reach the people in the like a real level, in the community level? Because sometimes the climate projects, they are big investment projects, but do they reach women? Do they reach people who are actually affected by the climate change? So this is something that the funders and the organizations really need to look at, to create models where we can give also like smaller amounts and smaller projects in the grassroots level without like a huge paper war. But then about the question of what women really need to be able to participate in the decision making, but also in a general level in the society and in climate action. I think we need to look at the root causes. We need to change the attitudes, of course, obviously, but also we need to look at the structural barriers that hinder women from being part of the society and doing and participating also in the labor market and in climate action. And one is the care work. Women bear a lot more care responsibility than men, for children, for elderly, for household chores, and unless this is addressed, we cannot reach gender equality. And I think this is something that Nordic countries have learned through our own history, that we really need to address the care.
Thank you, Minister Eide.
Well, I very much agree with my Finnish colleague here, and I think it's a very good question. When it comes, I mean, the easy part, of course, is when we talk about, for instance, development projects. We as donors can make sure that this is a part of our requirement for the projects, which we do. We have a very strong focus on gender mainstreaming in our development projects, and the same can be done from UN organizations. But the deep question is that society have to involve women and men in all decision making. It's politics, and this is not a technical issue. It's a political struggle for influence, and the Nordics are who we are because women, supported by an increasing number of men, by the way, but led by women, fought for emancipation, fought for sexual reproductive rights, fought for democratic participation, and also was very instrumental in, exactly as we said here, for developing an economy in which it's possible, for instance, to have children and continue to work, right? So, we invest a lot in education of girls, so they become engineers and doctors and whatever they become, and then they have children, maybe several, and then they go back to work because you have a guaranteed work, you have other people helping out with looking after the children, you have a public school system. That also makes, it's more easy to continue to have a career as a woman like a man, much more similar like a man. And you know what? That actually increases productivity. The cost of the welfare state is more than compensated by the increased productivity in society because more people contribute to creation of wealth, and there are less people who will be taken care of. In other societies, much of this happens in the informal sector. Now, it's not that people do not look after children and elderly and sick, it's just that it happens informally, and there's no remuneration of that. In our societies, it happens part of the public sector, and that is much more effective, and it also frees up talent for doing other things, which is producing stuff and producing services. So our experience, if there's something to share, is not that we got equal rights because we were rich. It's on the contrary, we became rich because we introduced equal rights, and then we had more people to contribute. So don't wait, do it early, because it makes sense in the economy. This is not only a Nordic argument. I used to work at the World Economic Forum, and we discovered the World Economic Forum are running, competitiveness index and gender equality index and several indexes, and suddenly turned out that the countries with the best, so the lowest, the number here is supposed to be low, so the lowest difference between income and participation in the workforce, etc., are also the most efficient, most competitive, and most transformation-ready countries. So it's good for your economy to involve women. It's not just the right thing to do from a moral, political aspect, it's actually smart. So if you want to go beyond middle income to wealthy, bring the women in, it's going to pay off.
And the director from Kenya, I see you smiling at these comments. What has struck you about what Minister Eide has said so far?
Thank you very much. Those are very powerful statements. I think from the Kenyan perspective, I would like to respond to the how, and also to respond to the donor issues that have been raised. In my previous life, I worked for infrastructure projects, power plants development, and what is very critical is that when you are designing those projects and when you're involving the local communities, you have to make sure, you have to make deliberate intention to ensure that the communities have the gender representation. And how do you do that? When you create the slot of the committee that you're going to work with, you have to say 50% must be women, 50% must be men, and this is how you are going to recruit them in a public baraza, in a public forum. So they are very clear on the criteria, on the bare minimum that you're going to accept their comments. But even that is not enough, because sometimes in that setting the women will not talk because they fear the men in the group. So you have to create a separate area where there's another woman who can talk to those women and then bring their voices to the table, so that the women are not talking directly, but there's another woman or an officer who works for the project who can articulate their issues, and they also get the chance to listen to what is being discussed. So the focus grouping is very, very important at project level. And also on this issue of green transition, of course there are a lot of examples that we could give, but on the green transition and how to involve women, and this now I want to talk at a personal level. As a beneficiary of a Nordic scholarship to study geothermal energy, we are so many of us and in Africa, and we have decided to come up with this African Women Advancing Geothermal Energy, and which is focusing on green transition. What we are doing without anybody's support is making sure that we are mentoring women. We are looking for projects which will support women who are struggling in energy development, to help them with the transition, with the knowledge, because we have engineers in our group, we have geologists, we have a whole array of professionals, and we do not want to sit on this benefit that we've had the privilege of getting, but we are sharing this information and mentoring and bringing up other young women and going to the communities and providing information and services. And this we are doing in our free time, and we are doing with our own resources. We are still working on building the African Women Advancing Geothermal Energy. I'm the current interim president, but I believe that every woman that is sitting in a privileged position or has benefited from a privileged scholarship or something must have a way of lifting another woman in order to have that strong support base, so that even when you leave as a woman in leadership, you have built up a big foundation, a big and broad foundation for other women to take over that which you have learned and that which you have known. And so the national government, the Kenyan government, I think a lot of women have risen up on their own. Kenyan women are very strong women. We have a lot of untapped potential in Kenya, and I believe that with all this conversation, even our women are also making that extra effort to rise above the barriers that are placed before them. But so basically, there are a lot of examples that we could give, but because of limited time, just give those examples. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Eide?
Just a quick comment. I completely agree, but I think it's a responsibility for men too. Actually, when when we are in leadership positions, that we form teams with women and men in them, which so that you build an experience and talent pool that can be drawn on later. So it's not I think it's true. You know, if you're a woman in leadership, you should think of it. If you're a man, you should think of it as well. And actually, you know, when you've done that for a while, over some years, eventually you don't need to think about it because it comes naturally. And last time we formed government in order to fill up all the positions in the staff with ministers, state secretaries and political advisors, we had trouble in finding enough men because there were so many obvious female candidates, but we had the rule of having as close as possible to 50-50. But that's of course the product, that problem, which is a very small problem, is the product of many years of thinking about this. So eventually it comes naturally, but it doesn't start naturally.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. From what I'm hearing so far, it sounds like there are certainly traditions that need to be dismantled, right? So I'd like to unpack that a bit further. But I do want to pull up a quote that we have, if we can pull it up here on the screen. It's a quote from an African Union official, and I think it really speaks to the point that these two elements need to be integrated. So the quote says, "Gender equality is a fundamental human right. It is also smart economics. Incorporating gender awareness and gender criteria into climate financing would likewise constitute smart climate finance. This is coming from the Deputy Chairperson of the African Union Commission. Dr. Bahous, what strikes you the most about this? For me particularly, this phrase of smart climate finance is particularly interesting. What about you?
Thank you again. I think I have expressed my opinion about financing. It's so important that we see financing coming to green transitions and climate action, that we ensure that women have access to that kind of financing, and that also whoever is handling that kind of financing, whether it is the government or the private sector or the banks or the grassroots or whatever, ensure that women are there and are benefiting from that. Having said that, I would also like to say that temporary special measures to ensure that women are major participants in the development processes of their own countries is so important. And we believe at UN Women that there are many temporary special measures that can be put to push women forward into the public sphere, into decision making, into parliaments, into governments, even at the grassroots level in certain areas and so on and so forth, because it is important that they are there. Now, there are another point of view that says, no, let's leave it to evolution. When women are there, they will be there. But we at UN Women believe that we need to accelerate. To accelerate that is by putting special measures, and we are happy to be helping a number of countries change their policies, change their laws, to ensure that women are participating, as I said, in parliaments, in governments, at all levels. Even we are happy to see that women are participating in the boards of the private sectors and other areas where they will be supportive. From my experience also in working, not only here at UN Women, but throughout the UN system, and before that as a development practitioner, I found that at the grassroots level, and leveraging women's agency is best done by women, by grassroots women. So we need to ensure that these women, as I said, have access to the finance, have access to knowledge, have access to best practice, so they can leverage all that to help their communities, their families, their children, and also to move forward into that. I think one of the special measures also that we can look at is to see that there is support for support services like childcare for all women throughout, in whichever way that we can do it, in whichever culturally acceptable way that it can be done in the different countries, because then it will give women the choice, and this is the most important, to give women the choice to see whether they want to join the labor force and how they will join the labor force, and when will they make that decision. To give them the choice and the space to do that. And that is also extremely important. I have seen that in many of the Nordic countries that I have visited. The special measures that took place some time ago, like you said, Excellency, were important. The women's movement was important. Childcare support was important. All these things are important to push women forward and to help them push themselves forward. They are resilient, they are solution makers, and we need to continue to keep pushing so that we keep them where they want to be, and we help them to get where they need to get. And I think also we can learn a lot from the invaluable experiences of grassroots women and of also indigenous women, especially at this time of climate transition. And we have seen many indigenous women and many grassroots women deal with the issues of climate and with the issues of drought and desertification and all this in their own way. We need to look for those experiences, for those best practices, and share them together so that we can help other women in different other countries. And we need to call on the private sector to join us all in ensuring that women are there, that women have access, that the policies that the private sector is putting forward are also gender sensitive, have the gender lens, and have the green climate transition lens. So basically, in the end, what we say is that we want the transition to be inclusive and to be just. And it will not be inclusive and it will not be just if it does not include both women and men. Thank you.
Thank you for that charge and for sharing those success stories, Dr. Bahous. Much appreciated. Let's now hear a bit more from our youth delegates, our keynote listeners. If we can get one of the Nordic representatives, that'll be great.
Does it work? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you so much. My name is Mathilde Angeltveit. I'm the youth delegate on climate from Norway. I really appreciate that you bring this important topic to this panel. I think there's been a lot of interesting points brought up. For me, what I was thinking about when I sat here was our former Prime Minister, Gro Harlem Brundtland, who said that everything is connected to everything, right? And I think this really highlights that gender equality is connected to climate change, is connected to food security, is connected to poverty, and so on. So when we solve the sustainable development goals, we have to look at them all connected, and we have to make sure that when we solve one problem, we don't make a lot of other problems, but we solve the other ones as well. So we have to be mindful of that. And I think in these discussions it's important to bring it home and bring it back to concrete policies. And one of the most important things is to look at where does the money go? What do we spend money on and what do we earn money on in our countries? So I'm most familiar with the Norwegian context, but I hope that the panelists can bring this into your own national context as well in the discussion. So I was thinking, for Norway, we export many things, but one of the things is oil. So it would be interesting to see the different ministries cooperating on assessing the gender impacts of our export of oil, having in mind that climate change affects gender or affects women more than men. So having some cooperation between different ministries, having the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Oil and Energy, and the Ministry of Equality and Culture, for example, looking at this together and seeing how can we push in the same direction in our export policies. And then when we look at imports from Norway, we have quite a high level of consumption, which is something we also have to work with when it comes to climate change. But this year we adopted a new law, human rights law, which is based on due diligence principles from the OECD and the UN as well. And I think we could also bring gender into these kind of due diligence assessments, right? To look at the things we buy and the things we spend money on, how do they contribute, or do they contribute in the right direction, right, when we think about gender equality. So that were some points that I hope you can pick up on and talk around and also relate to your national context. I think when we spend money and when we earn money, we have a responsibility to make sure that the money goes in the right direction and contributes to all of our sustainability goals. So that was my points, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Matilda. That was brilliant. I can see some audience hands. Let me quickly go to the audience, and then I'll allow the delegates to respond to what Matilda has just said to us. Let's get a microphone. This woman here, she's had her hand waving, so let's go to her first. Thank you so much. Yes. Yes.
Bonjour tout le monde. Désolé, je vais parler. Je me présente, je suis Jamila Garmouma, je suis du Maroc. Je suis de l'association, la Fédération des Ligues des droits des femmes. Et je fais partie donc des ONG marocaines et je représente ici le FNUAP Maroc. Donc seulement j'ai vu dans le titre, c'est très important de rassembler les Africains, les Nordiques, autour de problématiques de genre et la transition. C'est très important pour nous de prendre en considération que vous, au Nord, vous avez déjà de la démocratie qui est là, qui est installé, qui est instauré. D'accord? Au pays du Sud, dans le Maroc et autres pays africains, on est en voie de construire la démocratie. C'est-à-dire que ça, c'est pour montrer qu'on peut facilement, parce qu'on travaille avec un partenaire avec lequel on travaille depuis des années, qui est le Danemark. On a fait pas mal d'échanges et je sais de quoi je parle. C'est très important que cette aide des pays européens, elle doit être bien étudiée pour les Africains, où les Nations Unies doivent prendre en considération que le financement, il est déjà trop peu, c'est 0,01% pour le genre et pour faire face au changement climatique. Comment? Je rejoins la question précédente, comment on peut arriver avec ce financement faible à changer, et pas seulement à changer, mais avoir une transition, c'est-à-dire que le genre peut contribuer, ou les femmes peuvent contribuer à leur manière au changement climatique. Donc, si on prend pas, s'il n'y a pas de finance qui va direct à la population locale, comme vous l'appelez, aux autochtones, parce que les partenaires, ils ont un partenariat avec les gouvernements et aussi avec la société civile. Quand on voit que ces financements, ils sont donnés au gouvernement, mais aussi pour la société civile, quand on fait un programme avec la société civile, on demande quel est l'impact et qu'est-ce que vous avez transformé chez la population. C'est bien, c'est ça le suivi pour voir s'il y a eu ou pas de transformation ou d'impact, mais il faut poser les mêmes questions au gouvernement, à mon sens. Et là, je parle pour tous les pays. Quand il y a un budget, ça, c'est pour cela que je dis que le changement ne peut pas se faire de manière stratégique si on n'implique pas tous les secteurs, et le gouvernement, et la société civile, et le privé. Merci.
Thank you so much. So the audience member is asking again about financing. This seems to be a very relevant topic, financing and bringing partnerships between civil society, governments, and other partners on the ground. Thank you very much. So I'm going to actually bring these questions together, and then I'll take it one by one with our panelists. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I was going to interpret with the member.
Yes, you can continue, please.
Fine. So it's just to interpret because there's no interpretation.
Sure.
So I'm just going to be very brief. So we would like the countries that already have democratic institutions to be aware of how their financing in developing countries impacts civil society and how well it is used. I'm talking particularly about aid from the European Union so that it really reaches its destination. In order for financing, for the little bit of financing that exists to really reach very far, you really have to look locally at how civil society is actually going to receive these funds. After all, civil society projects always are requested very onerous impact studies. The same should be requested of governments. And this is another aspect of fairness that developed countries have to consider when they offer financing. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Let's take another question from the audience here.
Thank you very much. My name is Esther Moura Moiro, and we are part of the Commitment Makers. We are part of the group that did Women's Land Rights Collective Commitment under the Action Coalition on Climate Change. And I didn't hear so much about land rights. I'd like to ask the panelists if they consider securing women's land rights as primary to advance gender equality. I am so grateful that everybody talked about grassroots women. Everybody talked about the role of grassroots women. I want to hear your thoughts on how are we getting the resources to the grassroots women. And would you be our champion to pass the message about loss and damage? Grassroots women are not saying that we replace access to resources on loss and damage to replace adaptation and mitigation. who will mitigate, who will adapt if we are not supporting women who are dying because of loss and damage? It's just an opportunity for us to invest in loss and damage in communities that are affected so that we can adapt, so that we can mitigate. It's additional resources we are calling for. It is working with grassroots women, like you all said, who knows where the solutions are.
Thank you so much for that statement. Dr. Bahous did touch on the very important topic of land rights for women. I'd like to ask the director from Kenya here on stage, what do land rights for women look like in your country and in your region at large?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question, Esther. In my initial remarks, I mentioned land. For example, Kenya now has given access to, traditionally, land was only inherited by men. But now we have a law in place that enables fair inheritance by all children in a family. However, and I put a big however, it's one thing to have the law, and the reality on the ground is very different because the traditional are still stuck. And your own parents and your own siblings and people who claim this as ancestral land, which can only by tradition be passed from one male to the next male, from generation to generation, that barrier has not been broken, at least in many societies. Yes, the law is there, but now what kind of revolution do we need on the ground to make sure that everybody accepts this old tradition, to break this old tradition? So unless a woman is empowered to buy her own piece of land, or unless she has resources to lease a piece of land, then the law might not be, for lack of a better word, might not be very useful to that woman. And I also speak as an African woman and a Kenyan woman, and I'm also aware that I'm entitled to my father's property and land, but I'm also aware of what my family and my brothers expect of me, and they don't expect of me to start fighting with them for that land. So the best thing is that you just step aside. And for a married woman, it's good because then it's assumed that you are inheriting land from where you are married. But for single women or widowed women, it's still a challenge because even after the death of your husband, even if your husband owned the land, the family members and the brothers will still fight you and take that back, that land. So to strengthen women, to empower them, you have to have resources. Yesterday, I attended an award ceremony in GCA, and what those Indian women were doing is just asking, not even asking to own, but just asking to use 1 acre of land. So it's a big women group that was just asking for 1 acre of land to grow food, and they did so well because they were growing organic food. They ended up exporting, and the story goes that even during the pandemic, they were able to serve the whole village just by asking for a small piece from their husbands to unite together. So it's very, very important, but we need to find a disruptor that will break that barrier. Thank you.
So once again, it goes back to dismantling traditions, especially those that oppress people in our society. The minister from Finland has something to say.
Yes, thank you. Espen mentioned earlier that the wealth of Nordic countries has came out of women participation in the society and the labor market, and that is true. But other thing that is very important for Nordic countries' success is taxation, because we need taxation to fund for our social policy, education, etc. And now when we are in a times of climate crisis, we need to look at our taxation system. How can taxation, on the other hand, support lowering the emissions, but on the other hand, support the adaptation in the changing economy and in the changing society and changing climate. And it is very important, as we seen in the COVID, that social protection and cash transfers create security for people, they create resilience for individuals, but also for the whole societies. And for women, I think cash transfers are very important because they come directly to them. So I think in Nordic countries, social protection is and cash transfer systems are one very important element also in our welfare model, but I also think that cash transfers is something that can help women directly in the developing countries to adapt to the changing climate. But then about the civil society participation, I think NGOs are the best to reach grassroots and the women in the vulnerable positions at the grassroots level. That's why civil society and NGOs have such a high importance in Finnish development projects also. But I also see that civil society is very important when it comes to monitoring that legislation is being implemented properly. As was said here, the legislation doesn't help anybody if it's not being implemented. At least in Finland, it is the NGOs who are monitoring what is happening, and then they come to us and held us decision makers responsible if the legislation is not being implemented correctly. So I see that civil society and NGOs have such an important role for development for each country.
A very quick remark from Minister Eide.
I just very strongly want to underline those points. A society with a strong civil society that can be openly critical to the government is a key to a well-functioning government, because no government is perfect, so it needs sort of a feedback from the public, from media and from civil society, opposition and so on, and that cannot be said enough. It's incredibly important. And the relationship between taxation, as you mentioned, and participation is well known, right? And no taxation without participation, from famous slogan from American history, is that it goes both ways, because when you actually tax people and allow for representation, they want to have a view on what their money is used for, because it's their money, right? Rather than an authoritarian leader with oil wealth or something like that who can just have patrons. So it's very important to get all these things right. I will be the first one to say that we who are donors need to channel our support in such a way that we're gender sensitive and indigenous people sensitive, youth sensitive, and we do actually in our major national Norwegian International Forest and Climate Initiative. We're very much aware of involving indigenous people, particularly indigenous women, who sometimes are triply discriminated against because of their very precarious situation. So we do that as donors, because when we spend money in other people's countries, we will have an impact. There's no escape. So we might as well have an influence of what impact that has. That's interfering in other people's affairs, and that's fine, as long as you do it right. But let's not use that as an argument against developing countries doing their own thing, because there's a lot you can do without finance. There's a lot you can do in getting these things right, and exactly the point about inheritance laws, cleaning up all laws so all the inbuilt gender imbalance is replaced by gender balance, takes you a long way, because the outcome of this is not only equal rights, it means more people are in the formal sector because they inherited something, so they have a value, they can take a loan, they can demonstrate ownership of something, and that's a key path to development. So finance, yes, indeed, but don't wait for the finance. There's a lot you can do for free.
Excellent. A lot can be done for free. I'm also hearing you say no taxation without representation, resilience, and adaptation as well. So I'd like to get one more audience question.
Hi.
Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Bethan from the Sikh Human Rights Group in London. So yeah, we spoke about taxation, we spoke about access to resources and access to finance, but Finland has a 24% tax on menstrual products. Norway has a 25% tax on menstrual products. In 2004, Kenya got rid of their taxation on menstrual products. So obviously the costing of menstrual products, this is a barrier. If you can't afford these products, if they're not available, if I started menstruating today, I would have to go there and use toilet paper or go home. I would miss these talks. So we do need access, but as I think Matilda mentioned, we don't want to solve a problem by creating a new one. In the UK, in 1 year, 200,000 tons of waste is because of disposable menstrual products. They take 500 years sometimes to break down. We are working with a company who's created the first ever certified flushable menstrual product. It has 0 plastic and it has a 30-day maximum lifetime rather than 500 years. So obviously that is something that has been created, it is doable. But would you agree that this is something we do need to invest in? Because again, if you start at that level, if we want girls or people who menstruate to be at the table, they need to be able to go to school.
Right.
They need to be at this conversation and not at home leading. This is a really serious conversation that we don't have because people feel uncomfortable, because it's disgusting, obviously. No.
Well, it's very practical, so
Yeah.
thank you for that practicality. Does anyone want to respond to this? Yes, please.
Just a quick remark. Actually, in Finland, I made a law proposal that we should cut the tax on the menstrual hygiene project, but unfortunately, it hasn't passed. But I think we need to really get also the finance ministers on board about the gender equality. It's not enough that the ministers for equality or social affairs are on board. We need all ministers on board, and to really have the intersectional eyeglasses on. But I think the menstrual hygiene in the developing countries is such a huge question. Can girls go to school? Can women participate in the labor market? So I think this is a really question that needs to be addressed in all countries, and there are also taboos around menstruating which are really harmful.
Very powerful taboos indeed. Well, we're running low on time. I know that this is such a huge topic and we can only scratch the surface. So right now I would like to hear more from the youth delegates. We have another Nordic youth delegate as well as African. So if we can just call them forward to share your final reflections and any closing remarks and questions for the panelists.
Hello. My name is Mana Omar. I come here with the Fridays for Future delegation. I'm also part of the Generation Equality Feminist Action for Climate Justice Action Coalition. And I'd like to thank you all for such an insightful discussion. These are what we're supposed to be discussing, and as a youth leader, I'm so impressed and actually seeing us taking some positive actions from this. So we've been having these discussions around gender and climate for quite some time. We have all the solutions, we know the challenges, policies, we also have the policies, and we know what needs to be done. We also know that transitioning to a green economy presents an opportunity for us to redesign all this and ensure women actually take part in these positions and are involved in decision making. So my question, or just to be quick, is since this is a high-level discussion, and I'd like to know what is the disconnect between, for instance, we have here Nordic leaders and African leaders. What is the disconnect between this panel and the people actually making the decisions? Because we have a lot of talks going on, but then we don't see the implementation. I'd like to know from your perspective, what do you think is the gap? And how can youths, and especially those from grassroots communities, be taken into all these discussions, and how can we support their initiatives? Because we have brilliant initiatives. We're actually working with women, and we would like to know how we can contribute to this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mana. May I invite the other delegates, the Nordic delegate, to come up and share some final reflections for us.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Finner. I'm the Icelandic UN Youth Delegate on climate change. I've taken a lot of notes during this session. I think there was a lot of really powerful points made. So I want to begin by thanking the panelists for a really engaging discussion. I think, as we mentioned during the panel, we're mostly talking to our own crowd here. We're not reaching the people who need to be reached. it's not only about educating women, as we've been talking about, but also about educating men to challenge the pre-existing harmful perspectives. So I think we need to think about how we can bring the points that we heard here today to those people who are not here and really need to hear what we've been saying. My work is mostly focused on pushing for implementation of mitigation when it comes to climate change, but I also want to bring this sort of implementation lens here today. This is the COP of implementation, as we've heard. So I think we need to go beyond talking about the problem. The Nordics need to look beyond their borders. I think there's a lot of opportunities for the Nordics to really start sharing effective policies when it comes to gender and climate change between regions. How can the Nordics better share successful policies and support other communities in their implementation? I think this is a point of discussion, moving beyond the discussion and actually going towards the practicalities of how can we engage knowledge sharing between different countries. And it's not only from the Nordics to African communities, but also from African communities to Nordic communities. We won't solve our problems without collaboration, so I think this collaboration aspect that the Nordics really have been speaking about a lot needs to be put into action. We had a really good pledge last year at COP26 called Beyond Oil and Gas, BOGA, and I think this sort of pledge for concrete policy of moving beyond oil and gas is something we could bring into the gender debate as well, going beyond the gender discrimination that we're currently seeing, and also moving into the sort of intersectional and systems thinking, so recognizing that this is an intersectional issue and tackling the climate crisis isn't about tackling the climate crisis. We're not doing this for the climate, but to improve our societies, to build more valuable and more livable communities. My last point would then be that it's important not to only talk about the problems that we're facing. We've been really problem-oriented, I feel, during this discussion, which is good. We need to recognize the issues that we're facing. But I also think we need to put a focus more on the sort of benefits that arise from solving these issues. That's how we really get the people who are not on board already to get on board with us. One example that we did mention during the panel is that gender equality is a smart economic tactic. So bringing this solution-oriented aspect to the discussion is something I would like to highlight. Thank you.
Thank you so much. A big round of applause for our youth delegates. They were amazing. So now in closing, I would like to invite our distinguished panelists to share any final thoughts in response to these youth delegates. Also, what can you commit to do for the rest of COP27 and when you go home to really integrate gender equality and climate action into policy? I'd like to start with Dr. Bahous. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I'm not going home after this. I'm going back to New York. My home is Jordan, but I'll be going there around the New Year. But anyway, home now is New York, UN Women, gender equality, generation equality, and all the good work that the United Nations is doing to help push forward climate action and gender equality and all the issues that we spoke about. I want to highlight that the partnership with civil society is crucial for gender equality, and we at UN Women work on that. We also empower civil society, and civil society in return helps us a lot in what we do on development, in the humanitarian work, and also in peace and security work. And that is important because the three aspects of this nexus are so related to women and girls. And we, in many of the crisis situations, we find ourselves using civil society and the leadership of civil society in helping refugee women, in helping women running away from crisis or from drought, in giving them humanitarian support and other support that is needed. So this is extremely important and a major role that we feel is important also to be recognized here in this particular situation. Also, I want to say that the leadership of women at the local level is very important. You mentioned taxes, you mentioned reforms, you mentioned other things for women. We mentioned it all together. This is all important, and the more women representation is at the governorate level, at the local level, the better we will see things happening. Also, if we want to look at changing customs, traditions, or looking at how we can see, how we can work with them so that they can accommodate new ways of thinking, especially for women. It is also in so many ways from our experience that local women are very helpful in doing that for other women in their communities. So it is important to keep them there as well. As for what we will commit to do in terms of after COP and when we go home, I think that as UN Women we will be intentional and consistent in integrating, of course, gender lens in all climate policies that we work on, as it is our mandate. We will work with governments and with civil society on the policies, on the plans, on the strategies, and also on financing mechanisms. So we will use our leveraging power and our convening power as UN Women to work with all countries, all member states, to do that for gender equality. This is one. Two is we will amplify and uplift the voices of all involved in climate action, especially young people, as you all have mentioned, and also, as I mentioned, civil society, to help us push forward, including also with member states and within the intergovernmental space. I also will be, as UN Women, will continue to want to include more young women and more girls into all the processes for climate action and gender equality, and to ensure that we support the movement of young women and girls, that we resource them well, and that we value and recognize them in the work that they are doing, and that we amplify the voices thereon. And finally, I would like to say that I'd like to thank everyone on this panel for your contributions, for your energy, and to say to thank all member states also, including civil society, who participated in the CSW 66 last year on gender equality and climate change, and to see that all of us, we will work together to achieve the agreed conclusions, not only for women and girls of the world, but also for the world itself. We have all agreed that gender equality is a must, and it is a human right for all. Thank you.
So we have now less than 1 minute, so please, I'm going to challenge our panelists to keep it very brief. So the Minister of Finland, what is your one takeaway? What are you going to do when you get home to implement some of the solutions that were suggested here?
Well, we have already committed ourselves for a work agenda, and now I have to work that Finland should implement our commitments, and that is an important task. And also, I shall promise to continue educating men, as was said here, which is very important also.
Excellent. The Director of Climate Change and Forestry in Kenya.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll continue to work with women and civil society and youth in making sure that our national plans, gender issues are mainstreamed in our national plans. And most importantly, I think, because we said we need to do something differently, and I think that we need to identify opinion leaders in our society, like the churches or the male influencers that can help us change the paradigm shift. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Minister Eide?
One thing I want to highlight from the Nordics here at COP is that we have a solid tradition of involving civil society in the delegation. So Mathilde, who spoke from Norway, and Finnur, who spoke from Iceland, are actually youth members of the national delegations, and they are elected by the youth organizations. They're elected by the Council of Youth Organizations in their country, so they're not like token youth for youth washing, but they are sort of genuine representative participants in the group. It's a small part of a big answer. It's important that we have all kinds of voices at the table when decisions are made, and many decisions are actually made in the preparatory works for the votes and the speeches and so on that happens in delegations. And I think this panel has been, this day, and with the contributions for everyone, has been very helpful in reminding people of the obvious need to have a gender perspective on anything climate crisis, climate management, climate politics, and I think my main outgoing message, it is politics. It's not technicalities, it's politics. It's about power and distribution of resources and money. It's real hardcore politics when some win, some fail. And democracy is good because one man and one woman, one vote also means that half of the population is not going to put up with the structure that prioritizes half of the population. The other half. So it's good to have an inclusive democratic society, and it will eventually improve gender awareness, and we need to do more together to promote that also in COP.
A round of applause to our incredible panelists. And a round of applause to you all. Thank you so much for your patience and for your energy and for your insights. I'd like to just round up on my end with the quote, if we can just pull it up here. This is the quote from the Dalai Lama you can take away with this. It says, this beautiful blue planet is our only home. It provides a habitat for unique and diverse communities. Taking care of our planet is to look after our home. Well, thank you all so much. I appreciate this engaging conversation, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.